Hello, and welcome to my DC20 guide for D&D players. If you're watching this video, it's likely because you mainly play 5e and are either interested in trying DC20 or have some friend who keeps telling you that you just have to try it. And trust me, your friend is right. So, my name is Claudio, and I've been playing D&D for the last 10 years or so, starting with 4e, but mainly playing 5e. Over the last couple months, though, I've really fallen in love with DC20 as a system. I think it offers amazing flexibility in character creation, both for role players and optimizers, and enables more possibilities and character concepts to be fulfilled, all while having very balanced and fleshed out rules, especially considering the game is still in beta at the time of me releasing this video. Are you interested yet? Well, let me go over nearly everything you need to know as a D&D player to understand how DC20 is different, and be able to make good sense of the core rules. First though, let's start out with the familiarities between the games. Both games use a D20 roll high system, where you roll to beat a number, or contested rolls where both sides roll and see who rolls higher. The games also have a relatively similar setting and feel, with heroic high fantasy set to a sort of medieval time period. Additionally, much of DC20 will feel intuitive and familiar coming from D&D, as there are many classes, spells, and ancestries which are named similar to their D&D counterpart, and often have a similar feel, while still getting a fresh and new feel. Both games have the same basic idea of rolling a d20 to see if your attack hits, but this is where we can start to see some of the differences. First off, the defenses. In D&D, there's only a single defense, AC. A defense in here kind of means a value people have to meet or beat to successfully hit you. In DC20, there's two defenses, physical defense and mystical defense. Physical defense, shortened to PD, helps protect you from the traditional bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing damage, but also the elemental damages of cold, fire, lightning, poison, and corrosion. Corrosion being like acid from 5e. Basically the naturally occurring damage types. Meanwhile, mystical defense, shortened to MD, protects you from psychic, sonic, radiant, and umbral damage. You can think of these as damage types that come from supernatural sources. This split in defenses means a character could be tanky and very defensive for one defense, but not the other, and a true tank is likely going to try to have both good PD and MD. So, where do these defenses come from? Well, the attributes. These are like ability scores from D&D, but simplified in many ways. First off, you can see there's only 4 attributes instead of 6. On top of that, the number for your attribute is the modifier you add to things. So having 3 intelligence adds 3 to rolls that use intelligence. So no weird math where a 19 is actually a +4, but a 9 is -1. So, what are the attributes? First off, there's Might, which is like a combination of Strength and Constitution from 5e. Might affects your character's toughness and physical resilience, and will affect your HP and the amount of rest points you have. Rest points are similar to hit dice from 5e. You can use rest points to gain HP back while resting. Agility is pretty close to dexterity from 5e, representing how nimble you are. It affects your physical defense and your jump distance. Charisma is like 5e charisma, but also a little bit of 5e wisdom as well, representing your presence and force of will. It affects your mystical defense and the amount of grit points you have. Grit points being a unique mechanic that can reduce the damage you take from an attack or give you advantage on a save. They help you basically persevere through a tough situation. Intelligence is very close to 5e intelligence, but does have a little bit of 5e wisdom mixed in. It represents what it sounds like, intelligence. Probably the most intuitive attribute for new players. It affects mystical defense and the amount of skill points you have. So on top of all these attributes, each of these attributes are connected to skills, just like in 5e. So things will feel intuitive, like stealth being related to agility, but some things will feel new, like intimidation using might. Unlike D&D, attributes don't determine your ability to attack or cast spells, or even which classes you pick. In DC20, a lot of that stuff comes down to your prime, or prime modifier. This is a value representing your overall experience and combat prowess. It's a limit to your highest stat that scales with level, starting at level 3 for level 1 characters. And it is also equal to your highest stat, which will be 3 at level 1, unless you choose to nerf yourself. There is also a variant rule to just always have prime be at the limit, regardless of your highest stat, so it doesn't really punish you for having more rounded attributes, with none of them at the limit. Either way, your prime is used for many key elements of combat, such as attack checks, spell checks, and save DCs. In this way, the choice of attributes you make are kind of separate from your ability to attack or cast spells, and more relevant to what you want to be good at as far as skills and what you value defensively for your character, like HP, PD, and MD. While your prime might sound a little similar to proficiency bonus from 5e, there is a much better comparison, and that would be combat mastery. Combat mastery is equal to half your level, rounded up, and DC20 is a round-up system, so better just assume everything is rounded up. Combat Mastery is also added to your attack checks, spell checks, and save DC, just like Prime, but it does also show up in things like calculating your physical defense and mystical defense. So, neither Prime nor Combat Mastery affect your skills though. So how are those calculated? Well, skills have their own mastery system, which is similar to skill proficiency in 5e. It's actually much closer to skill ranks in Pathfinder, but I'm not as familiar with Pathfinder, so let me just explain how they work in DC20. Skills start out by adding the attribute they're tied to. So on the screen I have the agility skills shown as an example. So all of those would add agility. Then you get an additional bonus depending on your mastery level. This represents your training in some skill. Each level of mastery adds an additional +2 to the skill. So Novice gives a +2, Adept gives a +4, all the way to Grandmaster giving a +10. However, at level 1, your character has a mastery limit set at Novice, so you can't go above Novice until level 5. There are some exceptions, like Expertise from Rogue, which raises your mastery limit by 1 to Adept. This mastery system works the same way for trades, which are like tool proficiencies from 5e, representing training in some tool or profession. Trades often give you a choice on which attribute they use, but some are limited to a single attribute. Languages also use mastery, but there are only 2 levels of mastery, limited and fluent, and there is no cap or restriction. Lastly, the game allows you to sort of exchange points, so 1 skill point can be turned into 1 trade point, which can be turned into 2 language points, but not the other way around. So you can effectively turn a skill into a trade, and you can turn that into a language fluency, or limited mastery in 2 languages. Moving on to another big element of character creation in both games is Ancestries, which are pretty much like races from D&D. But there are quite a few changes, and most of them have to do with the freedom and customizability of the Ancestry system. So with D&D, you typically choose one race as your race, like Elf, and you get the benefits of that race, with some features maybe kicking in at higher levels. But there's no way to mechanically be half one race and half another, only the specifically defined half-elves and such, which are always half human. DC20 Ancestries are an attempt to fix this. The way it works is that you choose 1 or 2 Ancestries, and then you get 5 points to spend on Ancestry traits out of the lists available to those 2 Ancestries. So traits tend to cost 1 or 2 points, but you can also have negative traits which will refund you points, allowing you to take drawbacks in exchange for more traits. There is also the option to have multiple Ancestries, or create a custom Ancestry, where you can take 3 or more Ancestries, but only start with 4 points to play with. It gives you even more flexibility and choice, but balances that out by having 1 less point. This system is pretty representative of what I would describe as one of DC20's core design philosophies, which is not only to enable but encourage flexibility and customizability in character creation. With the Ancestry system, you can really start to express your ancestry in unique ways that will make it so that you can play 10 different elves, but all of them have different and unique combinations of traits. For new players though, you could always choose to take the default traits provided and not have to worry about it. Additionally, this system does give a very clear mechanical way to mix ancestries and have something like a half-orc, half-dragonborn. Building off this philosophy of customizability is the weapon system. The weapon system is focused around weapon styles associated with types of weapons, like axes, swords, hammers, etc. We'll talk about that later. As well as weapon properties. Weapon properties are a way to make weapons feel different from each other. Each property fits a particular playstyle and helps weapons work well in different scenarios. This isn't entirely uncommon in 5e, which has properties like reach and versatile, and these do show up in DC20 too. But weapon properties are a much more key part of weapons in DC20. Just like Ancestries, you can even create a customized weapon using a point-buy system, typically having 2 properties per weapon, but this can change if you take negative properties. So you can customize a weapon or weapons to fit the playstyle and feel that you want. Of course, the rules also provide a decent list of default weapons or pre-made weapons, so you can just skip that step if it's intimidating. The choice in these systems, like Ancestry and weapons, is there for players who want to get really detailed, but also has equally powerful options for players who are just starting out or aren't interested. The last major part of character customization I want to cover are talents, or as you would know them in 5e, feats. You get talents as you level up, and they provide a variety of benefits, including things like more skills or attribute increases. Now, unlike 5e, where you need to use a feat to get an attribute increase, in DC20, you naturally get attribute increases as part of your default progression. But talents can help amplify this. For now, the selection of talents is pretty narrow, but there will be more added to the game as development continues. However, there is one type of talent that is already very appealing: multi-class talents. Now, this will be a big adjustment to 5e players, but in DC20, you keep your main class for your entire progression, getting things like bonus HP, skills, and other benefits from your class. But you can still multi-class through the use of talents. So rather than abandoning your class entirely to pick up that one cleric feature you want, you use a multi-class talent to do so. The basic multi-class talent lets you pick a single first level feature from a class. Higher level multi-class talents allow you to take higher level features, and some of the very high level multi-class talents even allow you to take multiple features with just a single talent. Alright, that covers the bulk of stuff you need to know about character creation in DC20. So, let's talk about combat, and you know how this starts? Roll for initiative. That's right, you'll still roll for initiative in DC20, but it is a bit different. Rather than enemies and players all rolling to fill initiative, all the players roll for initiative, rolling a d20 and adding their combat mastery and prime to the roll. Now, I will note that currently the rules actually mention rolling a skill for initiative and the option to take the help action for initiative. This is going to be changing though, so I'm not going to cover it really. Either way though, all the party's initiative rolls are compared to an initiative DC. This initiative DC is 5 higher than the encounter DC, which represents the typical difficulty of checks in that encounter. If any player beats the initiative DC, then the player team starts. And if no player beats the DC, then the enemy team starts. So one of the big differences really in initiative in DC20 is that the initiative will always alternate between players and enemies. So to the left I have a picture to represent this. If the players beat the DC, then the initiative goes player 1, then enemy 1, then player 2, then enemy 2, and back and forth until everyone has taken a turn, and then the initiative goes back to the beginning. The real benefit to this initiative system is it allows for much more dynamic combats. Rather than having all the players go together or all the enemies go together, there's a natural back and forth in combat, so the tides always have a chance to change. Despite this though, teamwork between players, as well as responding to the actions of enemies and other players, is far more common than it is in D&D, and this is because of the action point system. In 5e, there are 4 main actions: your action, movement, bonus action, and reaction. In DC20, you instead just have 4 action points, shortened to AP, which can be used to do a variety of actions in the game. Most actions cost only 1 AP, but some bigger actions like spells can cost 2 AP. Just like how 5e has an object interact action that can be used for things like minor interactions interacting with the environment, DC20 has the minor action, which occupies a similar role. So, the nice part about AP is that it can be used for your reactions too. So you could try to make up to 4 reactions off turn, but this is another change between 5e and DC20. In DC20, your AP is replenished at the end of your turn, not at the beginning. So if you use all 4 of those AP off turn, it means you won't be able to spend them on your next turn, leaving you with nothing to do on that next turn. So then what's stopping you from just using all your attack actions to attack 4 times? Well, that's done by the multiple check penalty. Essentially, when you make the same kind of check repeatedly on your turn, you get stacking levels of disadvantage. And this is an important note. In DC20, advantage and disadvantage both stack, and every 1 level of disadvantage cancels with 1 level of advantage. So 3 levels of advantage and 2 levels of disadvantage becomes 1 level of advantage, or regular advantage. So, with the multiple check penalty, that means the first time you make a check, you do it normally. Then the second time you make that check, you have disadvantage. The third time you make that check, you have disadvantage 2, so you roll 3 dice and choose the lowest. And the fourth time you make that check, you have disadvantage 3, rolling 4 dice and choosing the lowest. This penalty only applies on your turn though, so if you can manage to get multiple opportunity attacks, for example, then that's a great way to get multiple attacks in without the penalty. The multiple check penalty also really encourages you to diversify the things you do on your turn, or empower the attacks you do make. But what if you did want to make 2 attacks in a turn? Are you cursed to take the disadvantage? Well, not really, because another staple rule of DC20 is spending AP for advantage. This is a simple but really foundational rule. When you make any sort of check or save, basically any kind of D20 roll, you can spend an AP to give yourself advantage. And if you really wanted, you could spend multiple AP to give yourself stacking levels of advantage. This can be used to nullify some of the multiple check penalties from before, but it can also be really useful if you just don't want to fail a save, or miss an opportunity attack, for example. This rule is here so you can spend more of your character's action economy on something if it really matters to you in that moment. And getting all this advantage in DC20 is particularly beneficial because rolling is damage. And what do I mean by that? Well, in D&D, your attacks have 2 parts to them. You roll to hit, and then you roll for damage. This sometimes ends up with weird feels bad moments where you roll an 18 or a 19 on the dice, getting a 26 to hit an enemy with an AC of 14, only to roll a 1 on your damage dice and do 5 damage. Instead, in DC20, you don't roll damage dice because rolling to hit is part of your damage. This is actually a general part of the whole system in DC20, not just with attacking. Rolling higher than you need tends to give you more benefits. Often this is measured by 5s, so in the case of attacking, you hit if you meet or beat the defense you're targeting. If you beat it by 5, you get a heavy hit, meaning your attack does 1 more damage. And if you beat it by 10, you get a brutal hit for an additional 1 damage, so 2 more damage total, because it's also a heavy hit. This can continue if you keep beating the defense by 15 or 20 or however many increments of 5, but there aren't official names for those like there is heavy and brutal. So if a +1 sounds lackluster, it's because you're used to 5e numbers. In DC20, base damage for weapons is typically between 1 and 2. Some can even be 0 damage, meaning they can only do damage on a heavy hit or higher. As a side note to all this, critical hits, so rolling a natural 20, add 2 damage on top of all the bonus damage you would get from things like heavy hits. But there's actually another common way to get bonus damage, and that's through weapon and cantrip passives. Remember how I mentioned the customizable weapons earlier in the video? Well, one big part of that is the type of weapon you use, which determines the weapon style for that weapon. Each weapon type has a different weapon style, which essentially lets you do +1 damage under certain conditions. So axe-type weapons do an additional damage against bleeding targets, or whip-type weapons do an additional damage if you hit people from a distance. Damage-dealing cantrips also reflect this with cantrip passives, typically related to what a cantrip does. So for example, Firebolt has a cantrip passive which lets it do an additional damage to burning targets, which is pretty intuitive. Okay, so now that we understand the basics of how to spend AP and how damage works in DC20, let's talk about 2 other big resources in the game, mana points and stamina points. Let's start with mana points, shortened to MP or mana. MP is used mainly by casters for spells, and it's a pretty large pool of resources or points to use, with a caster having 6 MP at level 1, but it only recovers on a long rest. MP replaces spell slots from 5e, but you can choose to use it much more freely, deciding either to use a bunch of cheap spells or a few stronger ones, or anything in between. You still can't dump all of your MP into a single spell though, because you do have a mana spend limit that sort of restricts the amount of mana you can spend. Your mana spend limit is equal to your combat mastery, and essentially the way it works is that you can't spend more MP in a single action than your mana spend limit. So outside of a few edge cases at level 1, you can't cast a spell with more than 1 MP on it, or more than 1 MP spent on it. This is functionally similar to spell levels from 5e. Every other level in DC20, you spend 1 more MP, the same way that every other level in DnD, you can cast a spell 1 level higher. There's also stamina points, shortened SP, or you can call it stamina if you want. SP is a resource used by marshals to use class features or perform cool abilities we'll talk about in just a bit. SP is much more limited. You only get 1 SP at level 1. However, it can be regenerated very easily by performing actions in combat that match your class's identity. For example, Barbarians regain SP when they get hit really hard, or when they hit other people really hard. Rogues regain SP for attacking enemies affected by conditions. Hopefully you get the idea. So, what can casters do with mana? Well, this should feel very familiar, cantrips and spells. Cantrips only cost AP, and have a variety of relatively simple effects like dealing damage or providing utility. Now, despite me saying that they're simple, they really aren't if you compare them to 5e. For example, on the left here is the Firebolt cantrip, a staple for 5e spellcasters. Except you'll notice that the text for this Firebolt is much longer. It has the classic option to make a spell attack, but it also has this Fire Orb option, which can be used to create light in an area. This is similar to 5e's Produce Flame, which can deal damage and be used to light the area around you. Then we can see that cantrip passive I mentioned before, but beneath that, there's those action point enhancements. These are ways to spend AP beyond the AP required to make the attack that allow you to buff the spell in various ways. Here we can see that I could add damage, increase the range, or force the target to make a save against being burned. Some cantrips even have enhancements that cost MP for particularly strong effects. Enhancements are similar to the Sorcerer's meta magic from 5e, but available to all spellcasters, and much more individualized to specific cantrips and spells. And that's right, spells are similar to this. In fact, this means that one spell in DC20 can actually feel more like a few spells in D&D combined into one. Let's take a look at Burning Flames, for example. This is your fire damage AoE spell. You have to pay 2 AP and 1 MP to cast the spell. Then you can choose if you want a line, cone, or sphere as the area of effect. At base, you do 2 damage to all targets, but you can enhance it with more MP to increase the size or add the burning condition. I think my favorite example of this though is the heal spell. It's the same cost of 2 AP and 1 MP, which is pretty standard for DC20 spells, but you actually make a DC10 spell check. The amount of healing you get or give depends on your degrees of success, and even on a fail, you still heal at least 2 HP. If you need really good heals at some moment though, you can always use that AP for advantage rule I mentioned earlier to skew the results and increase your chances to heal more. But a really cool feature is that by default, this spell has a range of 10 spaces. If you're touching a target though, it heals them for 1 more. This means that heal works both as cure wounds and healing word from 5e, without you having to learn both spells. You can even spend MP to reduce the AP cost, making it feel faster, like how healing word would cost only a bonus action. But don't worry, because unlike 5e where marshals sometimes get left feeling like all they can do is basic attacks, in DC20, marshals get a bunch of cool abilities. So let's answer the question, what is stamina for? The answer is maneuvers and techniques. If you played a 5e fighter, you probably know about the Battlemaster. Now, imagine the maneuvers from Battlemaster, but available to all marshals. They cost AP, but that can be paid with SP instead. Maneuvers can be used for a variety of things, such as enhancing attacks for more power and range, or adding effects if an enemy fails a save. This can even work for unarmed attacks. They can be used for other things too though, like adding a restrain condition to grappled targets, or defensive maneuvers, like parrying attacks or absorbing some of the damage for a nearby ally. Maneuvers can do a lot to give you reactions and actions that enable you to act on the battlefield in unique ways, even outside of your turn. But the most flashy and exciting stuff comes from techniques. These abilities cost both AP and SP. You can think of these like spells for marshals. They can allow you to do things like attack multiple targets, protect allies, or execute cool attacks like Heroic Bash, where you spend 1 AP and 1 SP to make an attack against an enemy, knocking them back. Or you could choose to knock them into the air, or even knock them prone instead. And that's just the base version. You could choose to spend more SP to do more damage, or push the target further, or even in this case, spend 1 more AP and SP to target all creatures within 1 space. So, one difference I also wanted to cover related to these spells, cantrips, maneuvers, and techniques is the idea of dynamic attack saves. This refers to situations where you're both making an attack and therefore rolling some kind of check against an enemy's defense for damage, but the enemy is also rolling a save against your save DC against an effect. In D&D, you would usually have to hit with the attack for the save to even matter, but not in DC20. The attack and save basically happen independently. So when you spend MP on a maneuver, or some AP on a maneuver or enhancement that forces a save, you will get that save to be rolled even if you miss. This is a good incentive to try to use that AP to boost those attacks. There is one last difference I wanted to cover between spellcasters and marshals, and that's spell duels and opportunity attacks. Opportunity attacks should feel familiar to a D&D player, but in DC20 they're only available to marshals. Spellcasters, on the other hand, get the spell duels, a reaction that can be used to try to stop an enemy's spell. This is similar to counterspell in 5e, but a much bigger investment and risk. To spell duel, you have to spend 2 AP and 1 MP, which is as much as a spell would normally take, and then you make a spell check against the enemy's spell. You can only stop the spell by beating the enemy's spell check, and even if it works, it basically means you give up the resources you could have used to cast a spell on your turn, including half of the AP you would have used on your next turn. Alright, that's nearly it. I'm almost at the end of the differences, so let's talk about what happens at the end, when your HP runs out. Death's Door. See, 5e has this weird quirk where oftentimes it's a waste to use healing on an ally who isn't downed yet, because any amount of HP will bring them back up as if nothing happened. I sometimes call this the down yo-yo, because the best strategy is to wait until an ally is downed and then bring them back. But this doesn't make any sense, and DC20's Death's Door mechanic serves to fix that. When you have 0 HP in DC20, you aren't downed, but rather at Death's Door. Things are looking rough, but you aren't entirely useless yet. As soon as you hit 0 HP, you get 1 level of exhaustion, which means repeatedly going down is a huge risk. And while at Death's Door, you can only use 1 AP each round, so you can still act on your turns, but you won't be able to do that much. You also can't concentrate on spells, and you have to make death saves to avoid taking 1 damage, representing you bleeding out. So, when do you really die? Well, you have a death's door threshold, which is basically an amount of negative HP equal to your prime. So for nearly all level 1 characters, the death's door threshold is -3, meaning you will die if your HP ever reaches -3. All of this means proactive healing is a lot stronger, and actually means your character wants to avoid being downed, which is intuitive and makes much more sense as a system. And that covers it. As a D&D player, you now know the major differences between D&D and DC20. There's still many small changes and differences between the games. They are different systems after all. But this should give you what you need to know to feel confident reading the rules and knowing what some of the new terms and mechanics are. I have included in the description of this video the links for the free playtest version of the game, as well as the Dungeon Coach's shop, where you can buy the most up-to-date version of the rules, and that will automatically give you access to the new versions as they come out. Just to clarify, the video I just covered is the beta 0.8, which is the most current version at the time of releasing the video. The free playtest uses alpha 0.7, but nearly all the rules are identical. The only difference as far as what I mentioned in this video is the custom weapon system. Finally, if you want some insights on how classes are different between D&D and DC20, I highly recommend watching a video series on that made by some friends of the channel over at Bardic Aggravation. I'll have the link for that in the description as well. Hopefully you found this video useful, and I especially hope you come to love this game as much as I do. Until the next time, have the best time.